Hi everyone. In this video, we'll be talking about the next chapter in our book. This is about security. Um, so some of things that we learn here is about like how to set up a login, basically like how to authenticate and authorize access to a website, and also how to do like secure coding. That is going to be what's covered in this chapter. Authentication versus authorization, the difference would be authentication is whether a person has access to your site or not, and authorization is what are they allowed to access in your site. So there could be like a partial access for some people, and you could have an admin that has full access. So that how the level of access would be authorization, whether they can even come into your site or not is going to be authentication. So if you see websites like Netflix, you can still browse some information, but in order for you to actually like get the full privilege, you have to be a member where they are asking you to log in. By becoming a member, you're being authenticated because you have a user ID and password, but not all members will have equal privileges. Some may be able to access, more data as opposed to the other person, depending upon their membership privileges. So just that's a general idea of what we mean by authentication versus authorization. So authentication is the first step, and then to further add a layer in terms of security is authorization. So that's the key difference. The other thing, before we go into the details of how we are going to provide authentication and authorization for our applications, I just want to quickly touch upon like some basic security aspects that any programmer has to keep in mind. Um, the first step is that never trust any user input. Um, the reason being, it is possible for hackers to send malicious code or malicious, data um, through any kind of input that comes in. It could be like an injection. It could be like cross-site scripting. There is a lot of different ways that hackers can actually hack in and like send data. They could be like setting data that is not even allowed to be set, like setting an ID of a field that they're not supposed to be doing. They could be changing like authorization for a user, stuff like that. So that is the reason why, if you remember in one of our initial projects, when we were like taking data from the user, we always use a HTML encode. So encoding is a very important aspect as a programmer. That's very important to think about. It should be one of the best practices whenever you code. And you have to hold yourself and others, accountable for that to keep the integrity of the code. That is one thing to remember. The other thing would be, do not write any custom sanitization code. Always use like the proper industry protocol. And do not create your own like ideas of sanitizing the code, or like validating some of the input, especially when it comes to security. Um, the other thing also is like just remembering that anything that is sent to the server there's a possibility that it was already hacked. So there has to be multiple validations, um, like using a HTTPS. Anytime you have like an external interface, that's very important, and that will ensure that you're using the secure socket layer. That's another thing to think about. Like like any kind of, there is nothing like an overkill in terms of security. It is better to be safe than sorry. So coding best practices, remember that you cannot just take an input from a user and assume that it is fine. um, Writing custom sanitization code or custom, some kind of validation code, that is supposed to be done using like proper industry protocol, algorithms for security, that would be a big no-no. Trying to always understand that any part of the data that's coming in, it could be a script, it could be a query string, anything is possible, anything could have been hacked. So it is passed, it is always that important that you code defensively. Okay, so that is going to be the first part. This is more of an introduction. So we talked about authentication versus authorization. We talked about coding best practices at a very high level. So now we'll be looking at how we can provide authentication and authorization for an application.